Welcome to Ballot Battleground, Nevada. I'm your host, Ben Margiott, a reporter at KRNV News 4 in Reno. I'm passionate about making politics in this critical battleground state more digestible to the average voter and pushing past the talking points to press politicians for answers. On this show, we take deep dives into the people, ideas, and debates shaping Silver State politics. It's been perhaps the most remarkable week in American politics in decades. A sitting U.S. president drops out of the race less than 4 months before Election Day. Joe Biden's historic decision on Sunday to step down from the campaign has upended the 2024 race in ways that we cannot predict yet. It seems Democrats across the country are circling the wagons around Vice President Kamala Harris, the likeliest person to take on former President Donald Trump in November. With all this going on, we didn't want to wait until Wednesday to drop a new podcast, so this week we're coming to you early with a special emergency episode with two guests, the editor and CEO of the Nevada Independent, Jon Ralston, and UNR political science professor Jeremy Gelman. We chatted about their reaction to the news, what it means for Nevada's 49 Democratic delegates, how Harris has already campaigned extensively in the Silver State, and the historical precedent for such a race-altering event this late in the campaign. So let's get right to our conversation with Jon Ralston. And I'm thrilled now to be joined by a man who needs no introduction, especially to listeners of this podcast, Jon Ralston, the CEO and editor of the Nevada Independent. Jon, you just got back from vacation, right? Did you make it back in time before the news hit yesterday?
I did. I got back the evening before and hoping to have a relaxing Sunday, but not to be, Ben.
Joe Biden had other plans. What was your reaction having spent time out of the continental United States, right? You were in Hawaii, so maybe hopefully not following all of this drama as closely as the rest of us here in Nevada. And then you get back, and the day after you get back, he's dropped out. What was your immediate reaction?
Well, I was following it, and I did tell my wife before we left, which was on July 9th, I believe, Ben, that by the time we got back, I thought that Biden would no longer be the nominee of the Democratic Party. So I missed it by one day. But as I've said, if there was anything that seemed inevitable, that still seemed so shocking when it happened, it was this sudden posting of that letter by the president saying that he was bowing out. So I thought before I left that he would probably not make it, but it was still somewhat stunning. And it's obviously, I've been covering this kind of stuff longer than you've been alive, I think, Ben. And This is still a historic, unprecedented event.
Absolutely remarkable in so many ways. And immediately, of course, Biden comes out and says that he is endorsing Kamala Harris, his vice president. And then in the hours and the day that has followed, we've seen Nevada leaders all across the state kind of rallying around Harris. What have you made from this kind of concerted, organized effort to kind of rally around Harris less than a month out from the DNC?
Well, I really think this has been the only option for the Democrats, despite all the crazy theories of being able to knock her out and put in someone else like a Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer. It just doesn't make any sense for all kinds of reasons, both political and financial, meaning it's easy for her to take over the Biden-Harris war chest. And so now what she's been doing is just working the phones, trying to coalesce all the Democratic support, which she's done a pretty good job about. Some of the national folks are reporting that she's already more than halfway there to getting the number of delegates committed to her that would give her the nomination. And no one else really has surfaced. As usual, Joe Manchin's name was floated, as it is every time something like this or even remotely analogous to this happens. But people like Gretchen Whitmer and Josh Shapiro and other governors who have been mentioned have endorsed her. So the real question now, I think, is who she picks for vice president.
Yeah, it seems to be perhaps a foregone conclusion that she will be selected now as the nominee. But walk us through the process, because Nevada has 49 Democratic delegates. All of them essentially were pledged to Joe Biden after he won the presidential preference primary back in February. There was no real opposition to him, of course, throughout that entire primary. Are all of those delegates free agents, free to vote for whoever they want to on that first ballot at the DNC?
They are. They're now unbound because Biden is not in. But as our reporter Gabby Birnbaum scooped this morning, Monday morning, they are going to meet tonight, and the reason for that meeting, my guess is to vote to pledge themselves to Kamala Harris, as some other state delegations, and I believe more, will do, so she can get over that threshold well in advance of the August convention. Now, there could be chaos there anyhow. It's a Democratic convention. Anything can happen. But this is a very choreographed circling of the wagons.
Absolutely. We went through and looked through as many of the Nevada delegates' social media accounts as we could find this morning and haven't found a single one that is not expressing support or endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris. So let's clear up some confusion, because there was some reporting a couple of weeks ago, not even reporting, but speculation out there that, it's too late to change the name of the person that's on the ballot. Nevada Secretary of State's regulation says that you just have to provide the president and vice president's nominees' names no later than early September. I think it's September 3rd this year. So from your understanding, everyone's understanding, right? They have more than enough time to do this, to change the names of who's going to be on the ballot, correct?
Yeah, Republicans have made all kinds of noises in the run up to this, Ben, about suing to keep Kamala Harris off the ballot. And some of the stories have mentioned Nevada as a possible target of a lawsuit, including from the very conservative Heritage Foundation. But they did faulty research. It's very, very clear that they have until September 3rd, well after the convention in August, to put the names of the vice presidential and presidential nominees on the Nevada ballot. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't sue. Anyone can file a lawsuit over anything, Ben, but it seems pretty airtight to me.
What does this mean for the general election, or is it too early to say probably at this point? I looked this morning, in the 538 polling average, still has Trump and Biden, and Trump was up by around 6 percentage points in Nevada when they bring together all these polls and get the polling averages. There's been a couple of Kamala in Nevada polls. Do we take those with a grain of salt at this point, given how, it's basically only been 24 hours since this all transpired?
Yeah, I don't believe any of the Insta polls that are being taken now. I mean, this has been a shock to the system. And so generally, polling is not good in Nevada, as you know, Ben, for a variety of reasons. But I think it has the potential to be even worse this year because, as you know, major parties now are not the plurality in the state. Non-major party voters are, mostly because of an explosion of defaulted registrations at the Department of Motor Vehicles because of the motor voter law. And many of these polls are modeling based on turnout that is not going to be nearly what they think it will be among those non-major party voters, in my opinion. Major party voters are still going to dominate the electorate. And so it's difficult to get a real read here in Nevada who is turning out. Nevada's in play. Do I think it leans slightly towards Trump? Sure. I think it did. There's too many polls that show that. But I think the polling here has always been flawed, or at least for the last decade or so. And there's no reason to think it's not going to be flawed this time.
Nevada is in play. There was some thoughts from some people out there, not going to name names necessarily, but they might not spend as much money here in Nevada with that gap being as wide as it is. You're saying take those polls with a grain of salt. And we've seen, to both Act Blue and the now Harris campaign, huge fundraising hauls in the last 24 hours. So there will be definitely money to spend here in the Silver State. One last thing before we go, since your time is so limited, it's not Taylor Swift or Shania Twain setting up a residency in Las Vegas these days. It does seem to be Kamala Harris, right? I mean, she has been down in your part of the state constantly. What do you make of all those visits? What have you gleaned since you've followed those visits more closely than we have here in the North?
Yeah, she's been here half a dozen times. She hasn't stayed very long, but this is always the very convenient thing for candidates to do, especially one from California, is do a stopover in Nevada, either on the way there to California or the way out of California. So it's a very easy trip for her to have made. But the fact that she's come 6 times, the fact that she has a Nevada political consultant by the name of Megan Jones from Nevada in her inner circle. She and Catherine Cortez Masto work together as attorneys general. She has connections to Nevada. Now, is that going to mean anything in November? It's way too early to tell, Ben.
Come on, John. We want you to predict everything here in late July.
Yeah, exactly. I'll make predictions eventually, but I think I'm going to wait about 100 days or so.
Fair enough. Things are moving at light speed in this news cycle. Appreciate you coming on and giving us some of your insight, John. We really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Ben. Thanks.
And now we'll zoom out and get some historical perspective on the events of the last week. Another great conversation with Dr. Jeremy Gelman. And I'm thrilled now to be joined by Dr. Jeremy Gelman, Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies at the UNR Political Science Department. Listeners know him, of course, if they listened to an episode that we did in person a few weeks before the primary. Dr. Gelman, Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Yeah, maybe talking to you a little bit before we expected, Ben, but I'm always happy to chat politics with you.
I was going to say, I thought we might reach out at the start of your semester, roughly, or closer in the fall. But here we are because of the, earth-shattering breaking news that happened over the weekend. As Jon Ralston said earlier in this episode, it seemed inevitable. We all expected that this might happen, and yet it is still so staggering when you get that notification on your phone and you realize what's happening. I mean, what was your reaction?
Similar to John's, right? It felt inevitable at that point enough. Democrats were coming out and sort of using the news cycle of the RNC to maybe cover their tracks a little bit and saying some things about a sitting president they may not otherwise say publicly. But enough prominent Democrats had said that this couldn't go on, where it did feel like an inevitability. I think what's more interesting is how the party has reacted to the vice president becoming ostensibly the nominee, but also how quickly she's sort of working to consolidate support among the party. So that part's been, I think, a little bit more interesting watching her strategy. But yeah, it felt inevitable when you had Obama sort of saying through surrogates that this probably couldn't continue on. Obviously, it's uncharted territory, but it'd been building for, I think, a long enough time that none of us were really surprised.
You obviously follow the news day to day, but in kind of your role as a professor, you're looking back in history and maybe zooming out. Let's do that a little bit here, because you could say unprecedented, unbelievable, uncharted. But I mean, really, how unusual is this in modern American political history? I mean, my sense reading up on it a little bit is that it's really never happened like this ever.
Yeah, someone dropping out this close to the convention, especially after they were presumed to be the nominee, hasn't happened since this sort of nominating system began. And it's important to recognize that we've only been nominating presidents this way since the 70s. Prior to that, presidents were being picked at the conventions. And people often say, well, why do you still have conventions? It's just speeches. It's sort of, for the Republicans, a little pro forma and a coronation for Trump. And this is the reason we have conventions. Since the 70s, every major party candidate has won a majority of delegates ahead of time. So the system as it was sort of designed in the 1970s has quote unquote worked. But if you had a system where or a situation where someone didn't get a majority of the delegates, or what we have right now, someone with a majority dropping out, the parties need a mechanism to pick their candidate. And this is why the convention still exists. So even people we think of as modern presidents, JFK, Eisenhower, right? These people were on TV. We have images of them moving. They were picked at conventions, right? There wasn't this elongated primary process where, party members were voting and delegates were being selected. So in terms of unprecedented, this version of American politics where, people show up at a primary or caucus and vote and then delegates are awarded and that person becomes the nominee, it is. The idea that a party doesn't select a candidate at a convention isn't the case. Most presidents have been selected at conventions.
Joe Biden, of course, as he did in every other state, won Nevada in a landslide because there was no real opposition to him. And so he has all of Nevada's 49 delegates that were pledged to him, and now they are released. They've been described to me as free agents, right? They can do whatever they want, but it seems the whole party really is coalescing around Kamala Harris.
Yeah, and this gets back to what the reforms in the 1970s did, which was people were upset that some states, not all states, were holding primaries, and they'd vote for Bobby Kennedy, for instance, or someone else, and then you'd get Hubert Humphrey to be the nominee. And so people are saying, well, what's the point of the voters voting if they can't have their say? And the big reform was on the first ballot at a convention. Who you were pledged to vote for, you had to vote for. Right? That's really all that this whole process creates. Obviously, Biden won't be available to vote for. And so all of his delegates will need to vote for somebody else. They can vote for Harris if they want. They're not obligated to. They can vote for whomever is actually nominated at the convention. But the extent that Harris is sort of locking up these delegates pretty quickly, I think the more notable news after obviously Biden dropping out was how quickly a lot of these state delegations hopped on Zoom calls and said, all of us are voting for Kamala Harris, right? That's,
Right.
I think, the most interesting thing to watch right now. So they are free agents. They can vote for whomever is nominated, but I think it would be immensely surprising at this point if going into the convention, she hasn't gotten pledges from a majority of those delegates.
Yeah, even in about 24 hours, it seems like the overwhelming majority of the party is rallying around her. And of course, no other candidate has said that they're running. And so at this point, it seems like she in all likelihood will be the nominee. Walk us through kind of what happened in 1968, before my time, of course, right? But you had a president who had accomplished many things in Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, and he ultimately did not win in the primary or didn't win the nomination. What happened there? Because a lot of people are making comparisons to that year.
Yeah, believe it or not, also before my time. But so, 68 was interesting. Eugene McCarthy was the anti-war candidate, the anti-Vietnam War candidate. Obviously, Johnson had been in office for quite some time after Kennedy had been assassinated. He'd won his first election in 64, and he'd prosecuted that war, and it was incredibly unpopular. And in the New Hampshire primary, which is, that first primary after Iowa, Johnson was on the ballot. He won in the New Hampshire primary, but McCarthy did better than expected. And that led Johnson to believe that this was either going to be a very drawn out process where he would have a convention fight, right? These delegates to the New Hampshire primary didn't really matter, right? It was what was going to happen in Chicago in 68. And so soon thereafter, he dropped out and had that sort of famous TV address where he said he wouldn't accept the nomination for the Democratic candidacy. You had a 3-person race between his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, Bobby Kennedy, who eventually gets assassinated before the convention, and McCarthy. And Kennedy and McCarthy were ostensibly the more popular Democrats with the rank and file voters in the party. Not every state had a primary, but among the ones that did, they tended to do better. But then at the convention, the party leaders got into a smoke-filled room, which is where that term comes from, and Humphrey was the nominee. And of course, Humphrey lost to Nixon by a ton. And so there were a lot of recriminations after that about how the will of the Democratic voters weren't listened to. These party bosses can't be picking people. And that led the party to reform the process into something that we have that looks like today, right? Every state has an open vote. The winner of that open vote leads to some amount of delegates being allocated. Those delegates on the first ballot have to vote for the person they were allocated on behalf of. So that's really where it comes from. It's different though, right? That Johnson was going to be picked at a convention. It wasn't that he was going to win enough of these delegates ahead of time. It was going to be a convention process. But the New Hampshire primary for him was a good indication that the anti-war wing of the party was strong enough that it wasn't obvious to him what was going to happen at the convention. So again, we think that's unprecedented. Truman not running in 52 was unusual at the time. He could have run for another term, but nothing really like this, where someone had ostensibly won the nomination in sort of what we call the post-reform period, the 70s onward, and then leaving the race, especially, 100 days before the election happens.
You've heard some criticisms that the way that the Democrats are going about this by all circling the wagons around Harris is kind of going not necessarily against the will of the voters, but by seems like kind of all hitching their wagons to Harris, avoiding, this kind of quick primary that had been talked about as one alternative, that it is similar maybe to the smoke-filled rooms era where the party bosses are kind of deciding. But then on the other side, you have 14 million people that voted for the Biden-Harris ticket. How do you kind of see this?
Yeah, the job of parties is to pick the candidate that they think can win the election. There's a lot of commentators who are describing some sort of open primary that would almost certainly make it more difficult for Democrats to win a general election. Right? Divisive primaries are about splitting the party and so close to an election. I think it's reasonable to say they would be in a worse position than nominating the sitting vice president, who is generally viewed as the next person up when the president, can't do something. Maybe not in this exact situation. But I think those sort of more far-fetched versions of how this was going to happen ignored internal party politics. It ignored, what Kamala Harris's role is as vice president, what she's done in building support within the party within the last 3 years. Not all the voters are going to be particularly satisfied with one candidate or another. No, I don't think any candidate has sort of come out as necessarily being able to beat her in a primary. She's a very formidable politician in the Democratic Party, especially with the endorsements she's lined up. And no one's come up with a reasonable process beyond the convention where this could be done in an expeditious way, where, states could print ballots in time, where people would have time to vote. I mean, this is sort of kind of fantasy land, right? And that the job of a party is to put forward a candidate they think can win the general election, and Democrats are doing that. It's through an open and transparent process. The party has rules about how the convention works. We know exactly who the delegates are. We know how many delegates she needs to win. There's going to be an open voting process. I think the idea that this is going to be, some sort of it's in the bag for her, I think better reflects her position in the party and her politicking over the past few years more than, the Democrats sort of going against the will of their own voters.
Yeah, there was some talk of the West Wing scenarios, the Aaron Sorkin drama playing out on national TV at the convention. It doesn't seem like we're going to get that, which is, of course, what Democrats want in trying to get this all wrapped up before the convention so that can be a unifying time for them. Have you gotten a chance to really reflect on how in, say, 2050, the kids that are learning high school AP politics are going to be studying a lot about what has happened just within the last week, in the last month? I mean, it's going to be a huge chapter in the history books.
Yeah, it's interesting how quickly these things are sometimes memory hold by people who are a little bit younger, but also how we sort of come to interpret things later on. We saw the 2000 election as being a real test for our system of government. And I think people learn more about that as sort of the frailty of the Electoral College, right? Certainly we'll talk about the 2020 election in the same way. I think this will sort of be reflective of a good lesson in how we think our institutions work versus what actually is written down and happens when, the stuff that isn't necessarily supposed to happen, in quotes, happens, right? That there's a reason why what we think are these sort of vestigial institutions like conventions still exist. And, that people who are really involved in these parties, they have a job to play. Their role is to figure out who their candidate runs, right? Especially in situations where it's not obvious. I think this is actually a pretty good example of a system, a party system, and a party working, right? That you have a party where their leader has unexpectedly left the race. They have a system to deal with that in place. They have a person they think would be a credible candidate, and that person will probably end up on the ballot in every state. I think that's a real sort of example of institutions working, right? It feels like this is sort of unprecedented, unusual, but in fact, what's supposed to be happening, whether it's Kamala Harris or someone else, right? But what's supposed to be happening is happening, right? That there is a group of Democrats all getting together later in August to figure out who their nominee should be. They have a process to do it, and they're probably going to pick the vice president. That doesn't seem so crazy to me.
It doesn't when you look at it from that lens, no, but it certainly feels crazy when we're in it and we're living it. So appreciate you giving us some perspective here. We'll have to talk in another week after 5 more earth-shattering political news events have happened.
That's exactly right. I'm always here to chat, Ben. Always happy to do it.
Quick programming note, this will be this week's episode. I had teased a mailbag episode on social media, but given everything that's happened, we'll push that back to next week. If you made it to the end, I really appreciate it. If you have guest ideas, episode ideas, questions, comments, compliments, concerns, feel free to shoot us an email to bjmargiott, Margiott, at sbgtv.com and put Ballot Battleground Nevada in the subject line. And if you have a minute, I'd really appreciate it if you left a rating and a review on this podcast, which helps it show up higher in searches so more people can discover our show. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.